few weeks ago, the Department of Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America initiated a series of webinar discussions and panel interviews on racism and injustice, prompted by unrest and protest throughout the country. But we wanted also to probe other challenging issues, perhaps related, but certainly apparent in our communities, such as anti-Semitism. There must be some link with the Passover story and liberation from slavery. As an Orthodox Christian, I admit I am appalled and scandalized by certain statements in some parts of the Orthodox world by bishops and theologians regarding our Jewish sisters and brothers, or by anti-Semitic assumptions in general about our scripture, liturgy, and history. So what is the role of the church or religion, which has often led some Christians who do not like to think of themselves as anti-Semitic, nevertheless to harbor views that ultimately reinforce anti-Semitism? Some of this, I suspect, may emerge from a narrow worldview that ignores what happens in the broader society as somehow being related or even directly connected to what happens in the church or in the heart. But some of it stems from a misunderstanding or lack of understanding about the roots of anti-Semitism. I am very grateful to be speaking with 5 special guests and friends. Reverend Dr. Michael Azar studied theology at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary and completed his doctorate at Fordham University. His research focuses on the New Testament, and his other scholarly pursuits include the relationship between Jews and Christians in the centuries after Jesus and in the modern era, as well as Christianity in Arab-speaking lands. Were it not for COVID-19, he tells me, he would currently be on sabbatical at Tantur Ecumenical Institute and Hebrew University's Center for the Study of Christianity. Dr. Pardis Chronakis is lecturer in modern Greek history at Royal Holloway University of London. He also taught at Brown University and the University of Illinois in Chicago. His work explores the interrelated histories of Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean. His research has focused on Thessaloniki during World War I, Greek Christian anti-Semitism, and Greek Jews at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He is currently spearheading a digital project on the social networks of Greek Jewish Holocaust survivors. Hanna Gais is a senior research analyst at the Southern Poverty Law Center and a journalist with bylines in Splinter, New Republic, The Baffler, and elsewhere. She received her Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School in 2019, and there she focused on Russian Orthodoxy and nationalism in the late and post-Soviet era. Joseph Potasnik is a rabbi and radio show host. He currently serves as the Executive Vice President of the New York Board of Rabbis. He is the only child of 2 Holocaust survivors. Rabbi Potasnik graduated from Yeshiva University in 1972 and received a master's degree from Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. He also holds a law degree from Brooklyn Law School. He serves as a Fire Department of New York and Fraternal Order of Police chaplain, and is the author of a series of 1-minute radio sermons called Just Give Me a Minute. And Michael Wahid Hanna is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Rice Center on Law and Security at New York University's School of Law. Hanna works on issues of international security, international law, and US foreign policy in the Middle East and South Asia. His recent publications include Order from Ashes, New Foundations for Security in the Middle East, and Citizenship and its Discontents, The Struggle for Rights, Pluralism, and Inclusion in the Middle East. Father Michael, let me start with you. Could it be that many might not even realize what it is to be anti-Semitic, or even when they are guilty of it? Is anti-Semitism even a problem?
Like many of the worst problems, perhaps, it is a problem. It is a widespread problem in Orthodox parishes often. But like many of the worst problems, it often goes without noticing. You know, the problems we recognize are not as big of a threat as the problems we don't recognize often. And it's a problem in the sense that really when the Jewish people, when Jews are collectively portrayed, I would argue even what some might call positively, but especially negatively, but when they're collectively portrayed as something, here we start to have thought patterns that might tend toward an anti-Semitic view. And I think many people just fail to recognize that, not just about Jews in general, but I mean, in this case, but really about many people. It's just when we collectively portray a people a certain way or collectively think of a people as a certain way, then it might tend toward first objectifying them and then turning them into an object of, in this case, derision or hatred or something.
Thank you, that makes sense. Rabbi, I wonder if you have any comment on that. You have to unmute, Rabbi. Yes, no.
This is the first time I've appeared on a panel where I've had the easiest name of everyone there. So I thank you for that distinctive honor. Let me say that we Jews, we know, sadly, what it is to be victimized by anti-Semitism. Someone spoke of collective guilt. And I think for too long in religious history, Jews were depicted as being collectively responsible for the killing of Christ. Jews were known as the Christ killers. Deicide was a charge very often that was thrown at the Jews. There was liturgy spoken of the perfidious Jews. So yes, religious history can look back, and I think sadly at chapters that are replete with those kinds of anti-Semitic attacks. I would hope today that we also look at some of the new chapters that have been written, because, you know, it was Elie Wiesel who said years ago, the tragedy of the Holocaust was that you could get away with it. I think today we live in a time where when someone utters something we feel is anti-Semitic, we're not going to let the person get away with it. We're not going to be silent. And I think that's a welcome development in religious history. So yes, looking back, there were shameful, shameful times. But also looking ahead, I think we can recognize that we've done much to eradicate some of those passages, for example, that denigrated Jews, some of those charges that were leveled against Jews, and also the idea of sitting together, dialogue, discussing, listening, and learning from one another. So we're not where we were, we're not where we're gonna be, but thank God we're in a different place today where we can honestly talk to one another with respect and honor. And that's a welcome development.
That's so true. And I'd just like to mention that in one of our other panel interviews, we are referring specifically to issues of liturgy and scripture and so forth. So it's not as easy to get away with it today. Pardis, I wonder if you can, this is not putting you on the spot, does anti-Semitism exist in Greece, in Orthodox Greece? Does it exist in Greek America? And what are the historical roots? How deep, how legitimate has it actually been?
Thank you, John. Anti-Semitism certainly exists in Greece, and I presume it does in Greek America as well, although we lack a systematic study of the phenomenon, primarily in Greek America. What one should point out probably is that anti-Semitism in the case of Greece, and I suspect in the case of Greek America as well, has taken many different historical forms. So we should not necessarily understand it as an imported vice, so to speak, of the dark side of European or Western civilization. There has been in the Greek-speaking lands a persistent religious Judeophobia, as Rabbi Joseph has pointed out, an understanding of the relatively few Jews living historically in Greek lands as Christ killers, as deicides. But what is interesting in the Greek case is that the figure of the Jew in the singular, as Father Michael has underlined, has featured very prominently in the ways Greek Orthodox Christians, as members of the Greek nation, have understood themselves over the course of the past 2 centuries. So the figure of the Jew, I would argue, sits next to the figure of the Muslim Turk as the kind of exemplary other against which, in juxtaposition to whom Greek Christians or Greeks in general have imagined and understood themselves. First, in the 19th century, as by singling the Jews as allies of the Ottoman Turks and therefore as enemies of the revolutionary Greeks. Then towards the end of the century as intermediaries or servants to Western financial interests. And then over the course of the 20th century as either Turcophiles or Bulgarophiles, or in any case, not an integral part of the Greek nation. I would just conclude by pointing out that there is a kind of a hidden or latent history of Greek anti-Semitism, which we still do not know about, both in Greece. Greece has for a very long time prided itself as being kind of anti-Semitism free, as well as in Greek America. Interestingly, 5 or 6 weeks ago, I came across an article in the foreword that pointed to the fact that the father, actually, the founding father of anti-Semitic publishing in America was a Greek from Izmir, Telemachos Timagenis, who in 1888 published a highly popular, today actually, amongst white supremacist circles publication called The American Jew, an expose of his career. So there are very many different strands that I think we're still unaware of when exploring and discussing the history of Greek anti-Semitism as a distinct phenomenon rather than a reflection of broader trends.
Right. That's fascinating. I want to come back to this actually. It hurts, but I think it's important to put the finger on the wound a little more. Father Michael, so Paris has mentioned the Greek almost ethnocentric sort of perspective. How does this ethnocentrism, which is very characteristic of Orthodox churches, how does this philitism, as we call it, impact anti-Semitism? Does it help or does it hurt? I mean, the fact that we're historically a local church that preserves ethnic identity so strongly, does it help or hurt?
I mean, one of the, I suppose, characteristic parts of the Orthodox Church that has been very positive compared to other traditions in history, that we've been very accepting of the local church, of diversity. You know, that this was not one universally imposed necessarily practice, but one that was welcoming to local expressions. Now, on the negative side, what this eventually became in the modern world is sort of a privileging of one local expression over others. And as I think Hanna will probably talk about maybe or address later, this has been taken up, especially by white nationalist movements, as a very good thing because it might lend towards segregation. You know, that this church is for Greeks, this church is for Russians, and the Jews can go somewhere else, you know, to the synagogue. So it's lended towards segregation. So in the sense that, you know, our welcoming of local expression can help the issue of anti-Semitism. You know, in some, we value local expressions of the Christian faith. At the same time, our histories often show that it might lead toward imposed segregation too. And now I don't mean just within, from parish to parish or something, but even within jurisdictions and offices in the church, you know, certain offices only reserved for a certain ethnicity, for example.
It's so important, and I think that's the reason we put together one of the panels on this issue from an ecumenical perspective, just how opening up to other Orthodox churches, other Christian confessions, and other religions plays a major role here. Parties, I wonder if I can press this a little further. Here in America, Greeks are well aware of the Holocaust. Is the awareness as evident in Greece? And in particular, I would ask, are Greek Christian collective traumas, like the Asia Minor catastrophe, for instance, can these be an obstacle in developing an awareness of Greek Jewish suffering?
Well, that's a very interesting and actually critical question. In a recent survey in Greece, less than 50% of the respondents actually opted to associate the Holocaust with Auschwitz. So in the Greek national memory, events related to Greek Christian history proper, sites, for example, of Greek Christian martyrdom during the Greek War of Independence or the Second World War, such as Zalongos or Distomo, come up with more frequency than Auschwitz itself. And this is, one might say, a Greek particularity, given the fact that the Holocaust is a Greek term that is not exclusively used, quite the contrary, actually, with relation to the genocide of the Jews of Europe during the Second World War. This creates problems, and not just semantic ones, not just problems of terminology. The understanding also, because it makes, not only does it relativize the Holocaust itself, right, the Jewish Holocaust as such, but because it's the centrality of traumatic events in the Greek understanding of the self as a victim of external forces, of greater powers, generates what historians and cultural anthropologists call victim competition. So a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding for the suffering of others, and in our case, the Jews, and also a kind of resentment that their suffering gets more attention, is prioritized in the global scene in comparison to ours. And this is the case, I am afraid, both in Greece proper, as well as in Greek America, where in the past decade or so, an increasing awareness or an increasing publicity of Greek suffering over the course of the 1910s and early 1920s in Asia Minor and the Pontus in particular, have kind of generated a similar sentiment vis-a-vis the Jews.
Let me take a different twist now. Father Michael, I wonder if I can ask you, how is it possible to address or even raise the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without tending toward either anti-Semitism or anti-Arabism?
So this is an incredibly difficult question, you know, and really what it comes down to, I guess, is when my first comment made, that when addressing the issue, one must be careful to avoid collective responsibility. And we get this, to be honest, on both sides, right? You know, when someone wants to be critical of the Israeli bombing in Gaza or something like that, they might start speaking in sort of the I guess you could call it traditional anti-Semitic way of, well, you know, you won't believe what the Jews did, you know, sort of a collectivization of the people. Whereas on the other end, you have numerous Israeli politicians frequently talking about what the Arabs are responsible for, what the Arabs did, if not the Palestinians, so as to avoid sort of a Palestinian identity, they speak of the Arabs. And I think, I mean, for a very complicated question, this would be my first answer, is to avoid collectively speaking about either side, but be as specific as possible. And I think this is very important because when one, you know, in this case, wants to be critical of Israeli policies or Israeli military action or Israeli militarism, as soon as one either purposely or accidentally, it doesn't really matter, but as soon as one begins to speak in something that has traditionally been seen as an anti-Semitic way of speaking, an anti-Semitic category, it automatically shuts down the validity of their point. You know, rhetorically, it serves no one because no one will be listening. You know, those sensitive toward anti-Semitism, with ears attuned to it, will no longer be listening to it. And I think this is very important because some of the critiques are, you know, very important, need to be voiced, but they have to be voiced carefully in order to be more effective.
Rabbi, I wonder if I can turn to you with the same question. How can people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without taking sides, without tending toward anti-Semitism or anti-Arabism?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Just to go back to something that was said earlier about comparative suffering, I think we really embark on a dangerous path when we start comparing my tragedy is greater than your tragedy. You wouldn't visit someone in a hospital who's suffering greatly and say, well, I suffered more than you have. That is not therapeutic. So I remember years ago that we used to have in New York, unfortunately we don't have it now, a museum of tolerance. And when you'd go in, you'd see stories of different peoples and you'd learn about their respective tragedies, not to compare, but to see if there were underlying, you know, common symptoms, underlying threats, but not to say my tragedy is worse than yours. So I think we got to be very, very careful. Now, when you come to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Arab conflict, I think people have every right to look through a critical lens and to speak about a particular issue. What I find very troubling and sometimes very revealing is when people treat Israel different than everyone else. When there's a standard imposed upon Israel that's not imposed on anyone else. I'll give you an example. We have in New York, it's called the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. And recently they put out a questionnaire and they said the following: if you run for city council of New York and win, will you pledge not to travel to Israel? And we looked at that, we were shocked. And by the way, when I say we, people of all faiths came together and said, this is terrible and we have to do something about it. We signed a letter, but it didn't say we shouldn't visit Iran. It shouldn't say we shouldn't visit China. There's a host of countries that are guilty of all kinds of egregious abuses, but Israel was singled out as the worst violator. And I think when we look at the problems of the Middle East, and by the way, we Jews have no trouble criticizing one another. As a matter of fact, someone once said that the Jewish star is a fitting symbol for the Jewish people because you have two triangles going in opposite directions. And I find that, you know, we're not afraid to oppose one another in an argument, as long as the argument is focused on a specific and not, as we said before, this collective, this generalization, and also using Israel as some kind of, pariah that, applies to no one else. What Israel does is so wrong, but everyone else is completely disregarded. Look, when I read about the Palestinian-Israeli issue, there's much to be discussed in it. There's a good book called The War of Return. And you know that in every country, unfortunately, with the development of a country, there is a displacement of people. But when it's always about the Israelis and the Palestinians, where there are so many other refugees that have been, displaced throughout history, when Jews were refugees that were expelled from a number of Arab countries. When that is not discussed, and it's only Israel put under the microscope, that to me is problematic. And very often that is indicative of an anti-Semitic sentiment.
Right. Well, I want to press on with this, but I wonder if Padis, you'd like to comment, because I know that the comparative suffering image that you came up with is actually very enlightening. I don't think it's one that you share. I think you were telling us about it, but do you have something to add there?
Not much, actually. Just to say that it's not something I personally share, but it's a way of talking or understanding the Holocaust in Greece and in Greek America. The Holocaust that is has a peculiar position, I would say, to generalize in the Greek national imaginary, as in others most probably. It's a kind of it serves as a template, as a model for other national traumas, like the Armenian perhaps, or the Greek or others, to fashion themselves and therefore speak to communicate a national trauma to a broader international public. And this creates the problems I have been referring to. So it's something that I would agree with Rabbi Joseph, that we have first to reckon, first to come into terms with, understand that this is the issue at hand, and then move forward in creating a culture of empathy and of healing rather than of resentment and competition.
Thank you. Father Michael, briefly, we started this question off with you. I wonder if you have anything to add.
I did want to mention the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish non-governmental organization that's especially public in dealing with matters of anti-Semitism, has sort of offered guidelines for criticizing Israel without tending toward anti-Semitism. Such as what I mentioned earlier, avoiding the collective responsibility of the Jewish people, applying the double standard that Rabbi Joseph mentioned, for example, and also historic comparison to Nazis, like what the Israelis are doing are equal to or worse than what the Nazis are doing, kind of thing. So there are definitely ways to encourage criticism without tending toward anti-Semitism. For me, one of the difficulties here, however, is that Israel is a state in many ways unlike most other states in the world, in the sense that it has a professed national identity as part of its description, right? The Jewish state. And this sort of, means that when someone criticizes the state of Israel, without perhaps intending to be or being anti-Semitic, without being anti-Semitic, those who might feel otherwise would associate criticism with Israel with anti-Semitism in general, which is why the ADL has attempted to establish guidelines, I guess.
So let me turn then to the history, to the recent history, and turn to you, Michael. Very few people actually understand the basic history of modern Israel and Palestine. That's surely essential to framing questions and answers. Do you see that as a problem?
It certainly is a problem. I mean, the starting position, if we want to look at this objectively and fairly, and to set anti-Semitism to aside, is that the Arab-Israeli conflict began as a political territorial conflict. This does not necessarily emanate from ancient hatreds. I mean, this was said about the Balkans in the 90s, and it was equally specious. This is a political dispute over territory, over nation-state formation, which, as Rabbi Joseph mentioned, it is oftentimes brutal, does result in displacement. And so, this should be our starting point, the kind of nation-state formation that resulted in the Palestinian refugee crisis. So if we begin there, looking at politics and history, I think we're on firmer footing then to adjudge the rights and wrongs. And I think there are lots of wrongs. I do think it is fair, particularly in the United States, to look much more, with much greater scrutiny at our allies and partners. I think it is different for US policy to critique Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, very close partners of the United States, than it is to talk about Bashar al-Assad or China or Russia or others. We have much less relationship with those partners, with those countries as opposed to our partners and allies. And so I think the relationship is different. And I think there's oftentimes an evasive move to talk about the crimes of Bashar al-Assad, which are legion. He's a leader guilty of war crimes and mass murder, but don't necessarily speak to the very close relationship the United States has with Israel. Issue in terms of foreign policy, I think a different character. And of course, if we look at the history, we see the ways in which religious hatred has been overlaid to what is a political conflict. That much, particularly since 1967, is a reality. We've seen the importation of various kinds of anti-Semitism from Europe, European anti-Semitism, into the propaganda and the discourse that has surrounded the conflict. And so the nature of, particularly in the regional sense, the nature of the regional approach has evolved over time. And as militancy on all sides has increased, we have definitely seen an increase in religious overtones and oftentimes a lapse into outright anti-Semitism.
So let me, before coming to Rabbi Joseph for a response here, because we're getting into the heated territory now. This is the sort of the bone of contention here. But let me ask a follow-up question before getting the rabbi to respond. The modern state of Israel was created as a secular state after the Second World War, 1948. And that necessitated the appropriation of homes and land from Palestinians that the rabbi mentioned earlier, and the creation of refugee camps. What, in your opinion, Michael, is the core of the problem here?
Well, so I saw in the beginning, I would start off with, it resulted in those things. I don't know that it necessitated those things, right? There were, particularly, in the interwar period, in the early stages of the Zionist movement, various ideas about what the end state of Zionism should be. And not all of them necessitated the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestinian territory, right? So this is a big, Zionism contains many with different strands. And so what resulted in 1948, I don't think was inevitable. It was one version of Zionism. And of course, in the context of war. And of course, yes, it resulted in the Palestinian refugee crisis. And of course, the crux of the matter still is that the occupation is exceptional in global terms, right? I mean, I think it's fair to look at it as a very unique situation. Palestinian statelessness particularly since 1967, it has no real analog elsewhere in the world. There are, of course, not to fetishize Palestinian suffering, there are many repressed people and oppressed people the world over, but the Palestinians lack citizenship of any state, whether their own or elsewhere. And so it is this the Palestinian statelessness, and I would add continued disenfranchisement, right? We see now continued expropriation of Palestinian land, and it is, I think, a unique situation in the global context, and it is that's the crux of the matter. It sounds very simple to say, but Palestinian statelessness and the open-ended nature of occupation make this now seemingly intractable. Rabbi?
Yeah, first I would say to Michael, it didn't have to be this way. When one looks back at the history of Israel, the 48 period, pre-48 period, there were many opportunities that were given to Palestinians to live with the Jewish people. If you look at Ben-Gurion pleading and saying, don't leave, stay, we will find a way to live, to work together. When you look at all of the opportunities for statehood over the years, one cannot simply say, you know, it's all Israel. Israel is guilty and the Palestinians are innocent. Sadly, as Abi even said, Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I look at the countless offers that were made for statehood. Obviously, when one talks about statehood or statehood for both peoples, compromises have to be made. But I think when one uses that moral lens, one has to look at both peoples, their behavior, what should have happened, what could have happened, and what is happening. I can tell you this, I'm always surprised when people don't talk about the many Jews who were expelled from Arab countries during those years, in the 48 and later years. It's always, you know, one people, the Palestinians, who have sadly become the eternal refugees. And what I'm saying is that did not have to happen that way. I think when one steps back and looks objectively, there were many, many times when sitting together at a negotiations table could have produced different results if Palestinian leadership had been courageous enough to say, we are ready to compromise and accept a Jewish state. I think it's the refusal to accept a Jewish state that has been the underlying problem in the Palestinian dilemma.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, the Abba Eban quote has been used a lot, and frankly, I think it is incredibly problematic. I think it is somewhat offensive to suggest that really and truly these Palestinians could have dealt with their problem if they just had been sagacious enough to accept the terms of peace that the rest of the world wanted to offer them. But let's look at what has happened since 1967. What wasn't inevitable was the settlement project. Theodore Meron, who was an advisor in the Ministry of Justice, and who taught me at NYU Law, I did my third-year fellowship under him, wrote a very famous memo to say the settlement project, if undertaken, is illegal under international law. Clearly not an inevitable step, but one that has effectively now, in the fullness of time, foreclosed the opportunity for a two-state solution. So, you know, I think there's lots of things that aren't inevitable. What wasn't inevitable was, you know, the refusal of the United States for many years to recognize the PLO. I mean, these are things that happened over time. To focus on one set of one party in this conflict to suggest they are primarily responsible for missteps, I think is also a distortion of what has happened historically. If we look at what happened at Camp David under, say, the Clinton administration, we see that what was, you know, there's the whole point to say the Palestinians walked away, they're at fault for all that's happened since. You know, negotiations continued. The Israeli terms on offer changed after Camp David. So, you know, I think pointing the finger is, you know, I think there's lots of finger pointing to be done. I think the Israelis have missed many opportunities. I think the United States has missed many opportunities. I think the singling out of the Palestinians, I think the weakest party in the conflict, that can, you know, there's no question that that is the case. I think is equally problematic, and I think part of the ways in which this discourse gets distorted, and I go back to this question and this issue of settlements, and, you know, not to take this too far afield from the core discussion, but that was clearly something that was nowhere near inevitable, and has expanded over time, and I think now means that we are in a much more difficult situation, and I do. I mean, not whether it's useful or not, you know, for this discussion, obviously, but from my perspective, you know, the two-state solution is over. It's finished, and now we will have to deal with a whole host of very difficult questions that that emanate from that very sad reality.
So I want to come back to settlements, and I want to come back to solutions as well. But Rabbi, brief response?
Yeah, I think Michael said don't just look at one side of Palestinians, but he keeps looking at only the Israelis. I say the following: from 48 to 67, there were no settlements, and yet you had the refusal, the rejection of Israel, the acceptance of a state there, when at a time when there are no settlements whatsoever. You had the Barak plan, the Olmert plan. You had 90% of the West Bank being offered, very generous offer that was rejected by Palestinians. So again, I think one has to look comprehensively, not just look. I'm looking at both sides, and I'm saying, you know what? I don't say all of what Israel did was 100% right, but I'm not ready to accept that all the Palestinians did was 100% right. I think they really have put themselves in a very bad place by refusing to say we can live with a two-state solution. That's happened since 48. It's continued, this rejectionist kind of thinking. And I would hope that we reach a point where we have new leadership in the Palestinian side that says, yes, the time has come. If other Arab states can recognize Israel as we have today, the UAE now recognizes Israel, we can as well. Let's find a way to live together.
And just sorry not to jump in, but current Israeli leadership rejects a two-state solution. They've worked constantly to undermine it, and so it is really disingenuous to imagine that this current government in Israel is working toward a two-state solution. That is a clear reality in looking at the composition of this government. It is a clear reality looking at policies in the Palestinian territories. Expropriation and settlement expansion are not the vehicle for resolution.
I've heard that of many governments, and I got to tell you, they said that of Begin, they say that of Netanyahu. The fact is, you have to negotiate with someone, has to sit there. When the Palestinians refuse to come to a table, refuse to negotiate, it's pretty hard to have a settlement when you have a party which should be there missing from the table.
So, Rabbi, let me come back to the issue of what sort of solutions we might have. If there are any, it could be that Jared Kushner is the only one that knows them, but we could turn to them a little bit later. I wonder, just to bring an Orthodox perspective in terms of a Greek perspective, at least, how one nation sees this conflict abroad. How, parties, if I could ask you, how do the Greeks view this conflict in the Middle East? What do they?
Thank you, John, for the question. It is, I think, interesting to dwell a bit on the place of Israel in the Greek, again, public imagination. Greece has been historically a country with very strong pro-Arab sentiments. Hamas, and I'm only half joking here, has higher approval rates in Greece than in Lebanon, actually. So there is often the case in Greece that anti-Zionism can easily morph into anti-Semitism. On the other hand, our Greece's, that is, or the Greek public's relationship with Israel is a love and hate one. Greeks often tend to envy, if one might use this word, Israel, and the way it has handled its problems with its neighbors, and kind of project the same kind of desire with regards to Turkey, and the way Greece should handle its problems with Turkey. So what might seem initially as a problem, the Arab-Israeli or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is external to Greece, in fact frames in interesting ways how Greeks understand themselves and their own regional troubles with Turkey in particular. So attitudes vis-a-vis the Jews, or attitudes vis-a-vis Israel in this case, can take many different forms and can in fact shape in latent but critical ways how Greeks think about their own state and their own regional position.
So let's take a direction now that might lead us into sort of a more common vision. Rabbi, I want to ask you a very different question. White supremacy is a galvanizing rally cry to some extremist groups. And this has resulted in defacement of property here in the States and elsewhere,
Right.
including the murder of people, 11 people at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago. How would you suggest that Christian churches might respond or react to these events?
Well, let me tell you how some Christians did respond in Charlottesville. One knows the hatred that was espoused there. People marching, against the Jews. A group of Christians went to the Jewish community and said, "We are going to form a protective circle around the synagogue, and we will say to those white supremacists, you want the Jews? You got to begin with us." As a result of that paradigm, we established various protective circles around mosques. I know here in New York at the Islamic Center at NYU, we stood around and we said, given the Islamophobia, given the attack that attacks occurred in New Zealand, we stand with you. You wanted them? You got to go through us. So I think what you're seeing as we get to know each other in a much more profound fashion, we appreciate the value of the other. I've walked by many churches and houses of synagogues, and I've seen the inscription, "You should love your neighbor as yourself." It doesn't say your Jewish neighbor, your Christian neighbor, your Muslim, your neighbor, which means it applies to all peoples. And I think there is a recognition that you cannot be a fighter against anti-Semitism without being a fighter against racism. You can't fight against racism without anti-Semitism. And I'm really proud to say that I think in many communities, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have come together and recognized the person who hates me today will hate you tomorrow. And there is a greater bond that has occurred, which I think can be a model for many communities around the world, that we are different believers, but we belong to one human family. And I would hope that's the direction which we take.
Thank you. Hanna, you've been very patient, but now we're treading on territory that's your specialty, that you've spent a lot of time studying throughout the world, not just here in America. I wonder if you can give us some of the background here. What do we mean when we use terms like far-right extremism? And how do these far-right extremist groups relate to anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so I think basically it's an umbrella term, and we need to sort of see it as that. It encapsulates a bunch of different ideologies, whether white nationalism or neo-Nazism, but also just general hate. So we're talking about groups that demonize and attack anyone who they view as an other. In terms of the Greek American community, for instance, that might mean the angry mob in South Omaha, Nebraska in the early 20th century. And that was a mob that carried out the Greek town riot, where over 1,000 rioters pushed out Greek men, women, and children and forced the entire community there to flee. And broadly now, what I look at, and what my comments will mostly focus on, are these white nationalists and neo-Nazis who often have taken up Orthodox imagery in their own movement. And a lot of what they try and draw on from the church specifically is what they view as nationalism and what they view as instances of anti-Semitism in its history. For all of these groups, anti-Semitism is a foundational ideology. Whether it's not, that may not necessarily mean that it's an ideology that they express fully at any given time, but when you really boil down to it, racism and anti-Semitism, as the rabbi said, do go hand in hand.
So I never cease to be amazed, of course, at how Orthodox Christians themselves exploit Christian teaching and Christian tradition. But what are some examples of far-right extremist groups that have drawn on or even attached themselves to Orthodox Christianity?
So there are a number. There are especially a number throughout the 20th century and the 21st century. So in majority Orthodox countries, basically some examples in Greece, Russia, and Romania are groups that have seized on religious rhetoric and imagery, usually for their own purposes to bolster their numbers and also to kind of lend themselves legitimacy. So in the first half of the 20th century, there was a group known as the Black Hundreds in Russia. They were known for conducting pogroms against the Jewish people there. The Iron Guard in Romania. Its members were called legionnaires who would pledge allegiance to the church, and as a result of them pledging that allegiance would expect similar reciprocity from the church in return, and they did.
When was this again in Romania?
They popped up in the 1920s.
Okay.
And then later and most recently, there's the Russian imperial movement in Russia, and that's a ultra-nationalist and monarchist group that promotes a vision of what scholars have referred to as political orthodoxy, and it's a monarch, as I said, it's monarchist too. And they've most recently made headlines in April of this year after the US State Department named them a specially designated global terrorist group. And then finally, of course, in Greece, there's the Golden Dawn. They have often attached they're a neo-Nazi political party that have often attached themselves to shared causes with the church and has terrorized those who oppose their agenda, as well as migrants and other minority groups. They've claimed to be defenders of the faith, usually as a means of drumming up support among the faithful, and they've found some, but far more, I think, have condemned it.
Is the Golden Dawn party still around in Greece?
Yeah, although, well, they witnessed a pretty significant resurgence after, basically during the financial crisis. They, to my knowledge, I mean, they've limited a lot of power as a result of arrests and some criminal activities.
I've always told people that if they've done one crime, it's that they've taken my name, Chryssavgis, basically distorted it, appropriated it, and they had no right to do that. All right, so a follow-up to that. In recent years, and it's no secret, especially during this administration, some prominent white nationalists in the United States have tried to claim Orthodoxy as their preferred faith, and even citing various individual churches and their ties to national groups historically and more recently. What do we know about these figures? Who are these figures? How do they claim Orthodoxy fits into their worldview? And should we be concerned at their attempts to paint the Orthodox Church as a haven for extremism?
Yeah, so the two most prominent individuals who have done that are two men, Matthew Heimbach and Matthew Parrott. Heimbach and Parrott are both the heads of were the heads of a now defunct group known as the Traditionalist Worker Party, which was a neo-Nazi group, but also it basically took up this mantle of claiming it was for traditionalism. And part of this traditionalism resulted in some of its members often finding interest in Orthodoxy, some attempting to convert, and others just sort of seeing the faith as inspiration. So Heimbach converted in 2014. He was previously Catholic, and he was very quickly excommunicated. I think it was only a couple of weeks after his conversion was formalized, after attacking a protester at an event in the Midwest. He could be seen there wielding a very large Orthodox 3-bar cross. Throughout Heimbach's career in the white nationalist and neo-Nazi movement, he would often wear shirts honoring the Iron Guard. TWP members would carry around flags saying Orthodoxy or death, and you can also see that phrase pop up a lot in their chat rooms, many of which have been leaked at this point. One individual who Heimbach cited both to me and to other journalists is St. John of Kronstadt as a major source of influence.
How's that?
He basically saw his connections to the far right in Russia as something that is basically, I should be able to do what I'm doing because we have this history. And even one member was a now defrocked old calendarist priest who would rail against ethnophilatism, claiming it wasn't a heresy, claiming that local churches basically have always been nationalist and that should remain.
Wow.
Yeah, and then
for our sins sometimes, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then the final example too is there in 2019. There's a fire at a civil rights institution in Tennessee, and the Iron Guard symbol, St. Michael's Cross, was basically drawn on the pavement outside, possibly by whoever did it. And we've basically seen TWP's influence show up in other places in the white nationalist movement. I don't want to say that it's their ideology in terms of what they saw in Orthodoxy was something that was common, but you did see a lot of people within the movement jumping up and defending Heimbach after he was excommunicated. So I think we really do, we shouldn't necessarily be concerned that there are tons of these people in parishes throughout the country. I don't think there are, but I think it does point to a problem within our own history that these are issues that need to be grappled with.
So parties, this is kind of different, a bit of an aside here, but in terms of ideology being used, you've drawn attention to aspects of the manifesto of the New Zealand mosque shooter that referred to Orthodox or at least Byzantine triumphalism.
Thank you, John. And in addition to what Hanna has very eloquently laid out, I think what up to now Greek Christians or Christian Orthodox communities more broadly have seen as problems foreign to them. The problem of xenophobia, the problem of racism, the problem of even anti-Semitism or Islamophobia are coming closer to the heart of the community. We understand now better how Christian Orthodoxy or certain readings of it can in fact lend themselves to very violent acts and very violent attitudes vis-a-vis other religious or ethnic communities. So Matthew Heimbach and American neo-Nazism is one case at hand. A second one that actually struck me as both peculiar, bizarre, but also frighteningly worrisome was the case of the Christchurch massacre that took place in March 2019 in New Zealand, where a young male Australian, Chris Tarrant, shot 50 Muslims in cold blood inside a mosque in New Zealand. Now, what is interesting with Tarrant is that although he had absolutely no Greek or even Balkan roots, he nevertheless kind of decorated his assault rifles with all sorts of references to Christian Orthodox, or more broadly speaking, Christian Catholic battles and wins, victories against the Ottoman Turks. And he also wrote the name Turkophagos, which translates in English, it's a Greek word that translates in English as Turkish eater, on his assault rifle. Now, Turkophagos was the moniker of a Greek revolutionary hero, a Greek rebel that fought against the Ottoman Empire during the Greek War of Independence in the early 1820s. So my reaction, many Greek media actually dismissed this matter as a kind of a curiosity, right? I mean, or as a kind of a distorted reading of history. And that might be the case. But I'm actually worried that certain ways of understanding our past that are conventional and are to be found among our parishes, either in Greece or in Greek America. Certain figures and heroes that we celebrate as such can in fact lend themselves to very violent readings of the past and therefore legitimize acts of violence elsewhere, way away our milieus, and therefore generate acts of violence that we could never anticipate, which means, I think, going back to our discussion about anti-Semitism, is that we should be perhaps more self-critical and more of our own past, and also more aware of the stories we tell about it, of the ways we narrate it. Stories of heroism can be turned upside down and manipulated, leveraged, and used in the most insidious ways. So I think there is a lot of good job, educational and other, to be done in this respect, both in Greek America as well as in Greece, in Greek proper.
So let's turn to the good news then, see if we can shape some responses, positive sort of responses or solutions. And let me start with you, Father Michael. What is or should be the Christian response to anti-Semitism beyond mere condemning prejudice and violence?
Well, I would say I don't want to underestimate the significance of condemning prejudice and violence openly and frequently, because, you know, when it's so often dismissed as a problem, then it goes unnoticed for so many people. But many other ways, I mean, you know, speaking really, I mean, I don't put a lot of value in the openness of public statements are important, but what really gets things done is encouraging, so to speak, on like the lay level, you know, getting to know each other type of thing. You know, like the anti-Greek riots, for example, in Omaha were mentioned earlier. You know, I'm from Wyoming, and plenty of places in the Rocky Mountains, you have a Greek Orthodox church built next to a Jewish synagogue because neither of them were allowed to be within the city limits at the time. You know, there are plenty of opportunities for Orthodox Christians and Jews on the lay level to get together, you know, from anything from, you know, we both love food festivals, I've noticed, to more significant issues, you know, of like gathering to discuss the Bible or political issues or something like this. You know, so I would love to see church leaders encouraging this sort of ecumenical or interreligious informal meetings, not just on the broad, more international formal level, of which there have also been those as well.
Thank you. Hanna, what about you? Especially in dealing with these extreme groups that you deal with. In a world where other faiths are respected, what are the Christian standards for tolerance, and how far can extremists go before they're infringing on basic human rights?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, for me at least, I think it sort of boils down to a holistic understanding of Galatians 3:28. I mean, we have to look at unity, we have to think about unity, but we also do, in addition to unity and the fact that seeing that we're all together, we need a community that is willing to stand up to those who are fighting to support a vision that is exclusionary, and a vision that calls for violence against others, but also even more broadly, prefers to push people out. So, and then in terms of how far extremists can go before infringing on basic human rights, I think a lot of the ways it's often framed is it ends up being a question of free speech, and while I will say that obviously the First Amendment is critical to our democracy, it's also never really been applied truly equally. We often have a conversation on how the First Amendment protects those who deal with violent actions and rhetoric, and that's often how we see this issue presented. But we also do need to realize too that, like, we have in American history, there have been limitations on the First Amendment that we've all agreed on. You can't scream fire in a crowded theater. You can't call for the assassination of an elected official. And I don't think that we should really let those who are calling for genocide and calling for ethnic cleansing, as these groups are doing, that they should be held to a lower standard.
I agree. What about a more secular approach now? Michael, the Knesset has been debating annexation of all its settlements and the Jordan River Valley and so forth into the Jewish state. And thankfully, there has been some progress and some more welcome news recently that Israel would suspend plans to annex parts of the Western Bank, and that the United Arab Emirates and Israel are taking steps together to establish more normalized ties. Is this good news?
I mean, I think it's been excessively celebrated. I think it's not a major change in the dynamics of the region or the conflict. I think from an Israeli perspective and from an Emirati perspective, I understand the motivations on each side. I think it is, in fact, probably bad news for the Palestinians. They're obviously not party to this agreement, but I think it has negative ramifications for the Palestinians. That being a major shift in regional dynamics. The idea that it could be a reward for eschewing annexation seems quite warped. Annexation is an illegal step. Not doing something illegal is not cause for reward. I think there is a problem, particularly in the region, of a lack of awareness, of understanding of peoples, of societies. If we look at Egypt and Israel, yes, there is a peace, an important one that fundamentally changed the dynamics of conflict in the region in many ways for the better, but it is a top-down peace. This is a cold peace of the security establishments. It is not a society-to-society peace. It is not a peace that has taken root among these two peoples, these two countries. And so, I don't see great promise in kind of changing dynamics in the region until the politics of the region change. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it is a reality. I think we will be grappling with Palestinian statelessness and dispossession for a long time. It is no longer perhaps the most salient central issue of the region. The region has seen political tumult, upheaval, mass mobilization, civil war. People in many parts of the region are concerned with their own livelihoods and well-being. But it would be a mistake to imagine that the region no longer cares about Palestinians in Palestine. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I think that is not a conflict that has any kind of near-term settlement. And it is something that I think is going to be problematic for the region. And to bring it back to this discussion, the conflict itself clearly generates, yes, political opposition, but a lapse into tropes and anti-Semitism. And I think we will see that, as a refuge for those kinds of ideas for as long as the conflict endures.
Rabbi, is it progress? Is it not progress?
Thank you. I am far more, I think, optimistic than Michael, in that I think it's a historic breakthrough. What's happened with the UAE and Israel, the fact that Saudi Arabia granted permission to fly over it, to land in the UAE. I think also when one looks back and sees that where people do sit down at a table to negotiate sincerely and seriously, breakthroughs do occur. I remember years ago, people said, Ariel Sharon, you can't negotiate. Well, Ariel Sharon vacated areas, Begin vacated areas. I just think Palestinians have to seize the moment, finally, and say, this is a time when we have to sit down and recognize that there are going to be two states for two peoples, that Jews have a right to live here, and so do we, and find a proper arrangement. We advocate for that, and I would hope that those who have been adversaries for so long can become allies. If I could leave you with one story. Years ago, I conducted a Passover Seder for delegates from the United Nations, and sitting in front of me was the ambassador from Egypt. And we came to that moment where we talk about the plagues. And I turned, I said, Ambassador, I know this is an uncomfortable moment for both of us, but the fact that we are sitting here together demonstrates that those who were, again, allies, adversaries yesterday can be allies today. The negotiating table is where we settle differences, not the battlefield. And I would hope that Palestinians come to the table and sit down and say the time has arrived when we need to we recognize one another and live together with respect and peace.
That's what we're doing now. Hopefully, it's what we're beginning at least now. One of the approaches that I like in my little knowledge of the conflict is a kind of a pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. It's a motto of the Telos group. My question is, and it's a difficult one, we've touched on it already, but Rabbi, if one criticizes Israeli policy, even when based on religious reasons, is this religious intolerance in your opinion?
Well, I think one can't generalize. One has to look at what is the specific criticism, what is it motivated by, is it something that applies only to Israel and no one else? Again, if you pick up an Israeli paper, you will see many statements of criticism. We are not shy. We are not reluctant to criticize one another. Criticism is welcome. We can disagree without denigration. I think that's when one uses that different lens to apply to Israel that one applies to everybody else, then one can be guilty of anti-Semitism. But your approach, and you sent me the material from the Telos group, I think this pro-peace approach where we say two peoples, two states, room for people to live side by side, that has to be our aspiration. And hopefully that dream will become a reality.
So Jews are good at disagreeing. We know Greeks are good at disagreeing. And we certainly know Orthodox Christians are good at disagreeing.
We agree on that.
There you go. Michael, what's your response to this same question? Is one anti-Semitic, in your opinion, if one opposes Israeli government policies?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, anti-Semitism certainly exists among those, some who purport to be pro-Palestinian. I think it is critically important for Palestinians and those who support the Palestinian cause to police themselves and their communities and their allies. I think nothing discredits their cause more than giving succor or refuge to that kind of discourse. But equally, I think it's very important not to equate criticism of, say, settlements with anti-Semitism. There are political, legal issues at stake, and one can, I think, morally object to certain actions without tripping over into anti-Semitism. So I think it's important to do both of those things. To police, Palestinians must police their own community. They must police the discourse among people they consider their allies and partners. But equally, I think it is often problematic to see criticism of Israel tarred as being anti-Semitic, and I think it cheapens the term and puts it in contention in a way that it becomes just one more contentious bit of politics, when it should be clear to us when collective guilt and issues of anti-Semitism are being tread upon.
All right, so self-reflection. Parties, what about the way forward for Greek Americans on these issues?
Well, I would say this will be a hard question to answer, but nevertheless a challenging and critical one. I presume or I imagine that the field of Greek Orthodox Christianity in America, given the presence of Palestinian Christians also in America, might also become a field where the Israeli-Palestine conflict will be reenacted outside the region. I also think that what we need to come into terms with here, perhaps, is that Greek Orthodox, Greek American communities and their parishes should perhaps go beyond narratives of heroism and victimhood when looking at their own past as Greeks in America, and perhaps embrace a more open and more diverse and tolerant, therefore, image of their past. And in that way, they could better incorporate the Greek experience of Jews as well as the Greek experience of Muslims, and therefore help build a culture of tolerance. This is going to be challenging because, and I'll end up with that, because identity in Greek America has been historically founded on an understanding of the centrality of Greek classical civilization for Western civilization. And we are now way past it. We live in very different cultural environments, and therefore this creates an enormous anxiety among generations of Greeks in America. And it's going to be tough, it's going to be challenging, but to my view, it's one of the few viable ways forward. Otherwise, phobias of all sorts will find very fertile ground among our communities.
Thank you. Father Michael, let me ask you to sort of bring this to a wrap up here. First of all, say something about this self-reflection, this self-criticism, but tell us something about opening up in terms of encounter and the Orthodox Christian Jewish dialogues that exist there, and what issues have they addressed, and has there been any significant modern Orthodox theological engagement with Judaism?
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be as clear as I can. After sitting here for a little while, I have so many thoughts in my head that first, the issue of self-criticism, which Rabbi Joseph brought up in regard to his internal Israeli domestic issues. Self-criticism in our own spiritual tradition, I think it's very important to note, is a very important trait. But the ability to do it well is often given, and the way we speak of discernment, for example, or diakrino in Greek, to judge through something, is a gift often given to someone else to tell you about your thoughts, right? It's not just a gift, like it's not just a person that can be critical of what they believe, but someone on the outside is used as a valuable reason, where they're doing well in their own criticism and where they're fooling themselves in some ways, and we do this with groups all the time. So for example, I'll give you an experience from my own history. So I took a class on Zionism, for example, at a Zionist foundation in New York. The fact that my family was Lebanese, I kept quiet for the entire semester, but so it was a group primarily of former Israeli, IDF people, young guys that had done their service and are now out of it. And while they were self-critical of many, many, many things, as someone with a different perspective sitting in the room, I personally did not feel they were critical of the right things. You know, but and I felt that's important to know. And part of this, the only way to really understand this is to welcome and encounter others, right? Christians can be very self-critical of certain issues, you know, but it would take an encounter with, you know, with a Jewish group to recognize where we've been critical in the right sense, and perhaps where even accidentally we've spoken too collectively. It works the same way within Israeli politics. Israeli politics that speaks of Palestinians or Arabs, even when they seem to be speaking very positively, I think are often very speaking misleadingly, very too collectively. I think the UAE deal is part of this. The UAE deal is viewed very positively, I think, especially by those who see the Arabs as a collective entity, rather than seeing the differences between Gulf Arabs or Lebanese or Jordanians or Palestinians, especially in this case. So I hope that's not too confusing. But so there have been a series of it really initiated in 1972. Archbishop Yakovos, who's known especially for his openness, you know, marching in civil rights, regard his openness to expand, I guess, the parochial or inward focus of the church and encountering other groups, began a series or initiated a meeting in 1972 between Orthodox Christians and Jewish representatives. It was primarily an academic meeting. It was primarily, to be honest, a Greek-Jewish national meeting. It was not really an Orthodox Christian Jewish theology meeting. It was primarily Greeks and Jews. And they were very explicit about that in the meetings. But I think this was recognized, and the meetings became international in 1977, sponsored by the World Jewish Congress and the Ecumenical Patriarch Center in Geneva as well. And since then, they've met 10 times. And in the beginning, I felt very positively they were discussing theological issues, especially like common interpretation of the Bible, view of tradition, sense of continuity and discontinuity from the ancient Hebrew period into the rabbis or into the church fathers. And in more later years, they've especially been addressing social issues in regard to like the environment or common statements against fundamentalism. And I see these as a very positive development. But if you don't mind, if I can offer a position of criticism on this, it's still been very dominated by Greeks on the Orthodox side. And in that sense, you know, what Christians are willing to be self-critical of is not known without inviting, especially, or without having participants from the diversity of the Orthodox world. And there have been some. There's been Romanian and Russian and a few others. But I'm thinking most especially, for example, the most recent meeting, it was now 3 years ago now in 2017, was in Jerusalem, explaining the history of Jerusalem and the two traditions, in the Greek Orthodox and Jewish tradition. No local Arab representatives from the Christian communities in the Holy Land were there. I feel that would have been very important to understand the history of Jerusalem by people that actually from the region, you know, who have been in the region for centuries or millennia. So the dialogue have opened up an avenue or an important place for Jewish and Christian dialogue, but I still think there's much more to go, because to date it's really dominated by the dialogues of two nations rather than the dialogues of religious traditions.
That's very helpful. So yeah, just be careful what you wish for. You may be getting an invitation to one of these dialogues at some point. Dear friends, Father Azar, Dr. Chronakis, Ms. Gais, Rabbi Potasnik, and Dr. Hanna, I don't know how to thank you enough for sharing your time, your honesty, your passion, and your reflections on this such important issue. And I hope this is just the beginning, a new beginning to a vital conversation in our church. And my thanks to all of you for watching and listening.